Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com, back again for another installment of High Power University. And we're getting now into a subject that is definitely one of my favorites, and that is we're going to be talking a lot about the high powers trigger subassembly, the fire control group, how all that stuff interplays and works. But mainly we're talking trigger, but it's impossible to talk trigger without going other places in the high power. And to show you here as an example, we're going to use our schematic. This is the original high power pistol. And what I want to show you here is, and we're going to try to see if we can stop this from moving so badly. What I want to show you here is this. The high powers trigger is, when the trigger is pulled, the trigger lever rises and it contacts the Sear lever. You see it outlined here, which is in the slide. So it presses up on this end of the Sear lever, which is leveraging down on this end of the Sear lever, which needs to contact this Sear, and so press down on this Sear. By the way, this Sear has the resistance of a long Sear spring, kind of a leaf spring sort of spring, not a coil spring, but a flat metal spring that sits behind this Sear, which discourages this Sear lever from pressing down on this end of the Sear. The Sear lives on a pin, and it's needs to be as fluid of a fit with that pin as possible. But on this end of the Sear, you have a hammer tooth that is pressing against the Sear, further wanting to keep this Sear in place. And that pressure from the hammer is being influenced by a OEM 30 or 32 pound mainspring. So you've got, and that 30 or 32 pounds is 30 or 32 pounds of push when the spring is at this dimension, this compressed dimension with the hammer cocked. So we have 32 pounds of pressure pressing against this Sear. We have another spring over here that is wanting this Sear to be kept pushed this way, which in effect keeps the Sear pressed down in this position as well. So this is the kind of a round robin arrangement that we have with the whole high powers trigger mechanism in the fire control group, and how it works. Once the Sear lever has sufficiently pressed down on the Sear, causing this end of the Sear to rise up past the edge of this hammer tooth, the hammer is then free to come home to the firing pin, igniting the cartridge, and we have ignition. So we're going to be talking about this, but I wanted to show you this, and the reason why it's very difficult to talk about a trigger. If we're going to talk about a trigger past the point that involves pulling the trigger and the trigger resetting, and those kinds of things. Now, the reason that we're going to go in kind of such depth on this is because all of these firearms have been cleared and checked prior to our demonstration here. This is a 1911. John Browning designed it. John Browning knew what the trigger finger liked, and this was John Browning's design and interpretation for a full-size handgun and what the trigger should be. And the take-up is about that much travel. The break is about that much more travel. And then at the point the slide comes rearward, we have just a little bit more trigger travel. We would call over travel, not much, but it's there. And then the reset happens just like that. Absolutely incredible. And this is an out of the box, that trigger mechanism's really not been modified by much other than the SFS Sear. The SFS hammer. But that was John Browning's interpretation of a trigger. This mechanism has two bars that come inside the frame, basically directly back to that Sear and hammer tooth relationship, which lives a little lower oriented in the 1911, but that is the whole story about the trigger. And you notice this, it is a very straight back trigger pull. In other words, your finger is just like this. John Browning's trigger on an auto 5 shotgun, on his 22 semi-auto rifle, his 22 target pistols. This same kind of a trigger action is pretty much the way John Browning triggers are, and very pure, very straight back. And that did not happen with the high power. And we do know that there are at least some aspects of what we are now talking about with respect to the high powers trigger that John Browning was not responsible for whatsoever. Specifically, one of those things being the magazine disconnect, which I've always found this part of the high power schematic to be highly interesting, because it's just not something we ever see John Browning did. In fact, in the 1911, some differences in the 1911. John Browning's approaches were very, very straightforward, very kind of linear. The extractor went in the back of the slide and it came out on a straight line in the front of the slide. In the high power, it starts out up in this part of the slide, about the 1:30, 2 o'clock position, and then it goes in and it goes at a slope. John Browning's design work was this very linear, very direct. In fact, on the 1911, it is this just very direct trigger action back to the part that activates the sear and hammer tooth so the weapon will fire. Nothing complicated about it, and it was a hallmark of his design. In the high power, when the high power first began being designed, John Browning was having to do workarounds all around his own patents that he had sold to the United States government for the 1911. So he was having to invent even a better mousetrap than he had invented before. And what changes with the high power are the steps of things and where this whole chain of events goes. And the fact that it goes into the slide at all is very different from the 1911. This 1911 frame I just showed you, I can take the slide off, I can pull the trigger, and the hammer will fly forward. In a high power, you can pull this trigger without this slide on it all day long, and this hammer is never going to move. Much more direct approach with the 1911, and this particular design of the high powers trigger, we're going to go into just a little bit of exactly what happens when the high power functions. When the trigger is pulled here, and this example shows the magazine disconnect. The magazine goes in, presses on this magazine disconnect, and that causes this trigger lever to be situated right here under this sear lever. If the magazine comes out and this magazine disconnect can move this direction, that will cause this trigger lever to come forward of the sear lever, and then you cannot fire the weapon even if there's one in the chamber, because the trigger lever is going to miss the sear lever entirely, which is what we have to have happen in order for the weapon to fire. So we pull the trigger. The magazine is in. The trigger lever is positioned. It presses up against this sear. The sear presses down against the resistance of both the mainspring and the sear spring, lifts the engagement area of the sear with the hammer tooth upwards. Hammer flies forward. We have ignition. Now the slide begins to recoil. And when the slide begins to recoil, that means the sear lever and the whole slide begins moving rearward. The trigger lever doesn't go anywhere. So when the slide starts rearward, this is when we will sense or feel in the trigger any what we would call over travel at that point. In other words, we'll use this Arcus here as an example. I have my take up, break there, and then when the slide starts rearward, watch my finger. Do you see my trigger finger move a little bit further rearward? That was that sear lever coming rearward, and now the trigger lever has nothing keeping it from coming up further. into the slide, and it will until the front part of the trigger, or this part right here. This is your trigger front stop. So now the trigger can over travel until it's reached the front stop, and this front stop lives in what we call the trigger well area of the frame. So when the trigger is pulled rearward, this front stop, which shows on our schematic right there, when it's pulled and reaches the bottom of this, what I call trigger well area, that's where the front of your trigger return spring lives, you can then no longer pull the trigger any further rearward, and then the forward motion of the trigger travel we call reset. Now, for our purposes, we're going to talk about this in just a little bit of a different way. I'm going to go back to our Arcus real quickly. And what I want to point out to you is this, is take up, brake, over travel. I sensed my finger move just a little bit rearward, not much. Now, when I come back forward with the trigger, I want you to listen. Right there, that click. That is reset. Everything before that, that motion that you saw, which is here, this is forward movement of the trigger. This is not reset. That, what you just heard right there, is, for our discussion, that is reset. When you hear the trigger lever, then spring back rearward. Because what has happened when, and this is a very, very important thing to understand, and you're going to understand why here in just a few more minutes or a couple more sessions, but you envision this, when this trigger lever pushes up on the sear lever presses down the sear, this into the sear comes up, causing the hammer to come forward. At that point, and now we have had whatever over travel there is, because the sear lever moves rearward and is no longer above the trigger lever. At that point, this slide cycles faster than the trigger finger is probably going to let go of the trigger. And now envision this trigger lever up and this sear lever coming back forward. That sear lever must engage the trigger lever right here, and then press that trigger lever forward in the channel, and the slide will come all the way forward, and that's where that trigger lever stays. When you've pulled the trigger and you still have that trigger pulled all the way, that trigger lever is now approximately right there. When you release the trigger lever, now the trigger lever, which is this part, is engaged with this front face of this sear lever. Your trigger lever starts to come down as you allow the trigger to come forward, and as it comes down under the sear lever, that reset click you heard was this trigger lever snapping back in the channel. That is how they reset. In terms of talking and our conversation and learning here about how do I have the least amount of take up, how do I have the least amount of reset, how do I have the the shortest possible take up, break, reset combination, shortest reset, and everything like that. And understanding that the reason we're asking these questions and the reason that we all do is basically this handgun and what we've come to expect from a John Browning trigger. And after all, this usually is called the Browning High Power. So it's kind of what we have come to expect. And so it's become a favorite subject because it's one of those areas that there was room left for improvement in this original design, quite frankly, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about. A couple of other things I want to point out here on the schematic for our session today. Many people say that if I take out this magazine disconnect, this is going to clean up the take-up, and it's not going to reduce the trigger break. This is actually false. In our experience, you do reduce the trigger brake a little bit, usually around a half a pound to 3/4 of a pound, roughly, by removal of the magazine disconnect device. There's a lot written online about that. If you remove this magazine disconnect device, the only positive positioning you have of the trigger lever is the trigger return spring. So that's one important thing we want to note right there. When the trigger is pulled, it is compressing this magazine disconnect against a spring that lives inside the trigger. So the more compressed this magazine disconnect gets, the stronger this spring gets, or the more force it exerts. So when you're back through the take-up and you are at the point of the trigger brake of the Sear disconnecting here from the hammer tooth, or clearing the hammer tooth, at that point you're also pulling against the most robust energy that you're going to have out of this magazine disconnect, and you're pulling against it. And that's a little bit heightened because this angle that you see that we're pulling against, it's an opposing angle. It doesn't really want to do what we're asking it to do. So all of this together, yes, it does create a more of a trigger brake, a higher trigger brake, if you will, because of everything that's going on at that moment of the actual brake. Now, another aspect that's seldom talked about this magazine disconnect is this very same device that is resisting the trigger being pulled rearward also encourages the trigger to reset forward. So it's not uncommon to hear guys that have said, well, man, I removed my magazine disconnect and I have this so much cleaner take up and the brake is lighter and the world is wonderful, except for the reset is kind of anemic. And you may find that actually. And the reason is because you've taken out a factor in the whole reset equation, which is partially the reason that this trigger comes forward is because of that magazine disconnect device. We'll be back in touch with this whole device and what it's all about and how to optimize it and things here in another session. But this is what's going on. This is what's happening. Want to focus in on, first of all, the trigger lever lives approximately here in the frame. The Sear lever lives in the slide. And there is going to be always a certain amount of distance between this trigger lever, where it lives, and this Sear lever, which is up in the slide where it lives. There is always going to be a distance between these two that must be bridged by range of the trigger. In other words, take up. To have no take up in a high power pistol is going to necessitate you to have a unusual and inappropriate amount of over travel. And let me explain this here just one second. In order for this trigger lever to function the way that it should, the trigger lever must make a minimum height when the trigger is completely pulled past the trigger brake. It must make a minimum height, or the front of this Sear lever, when the slide is coming back forward, will not catch this front edge, or the front edge of the top of the Sear lever will slip underneath. In this case of this example, the Sear lever floats, which makes this sort of a moving target, actually. So what that means is this trigger lever must come up far enough in order for the front edge of this Sear lever, when the slide is coming back forward, to move this trigger lever forward and keep it forward until this trigger has been released, which means the trigger lever comes down, which means now it can move rearward in its slot and it has reset. If this trigger lever, and I'm going to give you the punchline here, and as I do, I just want to say, absolutely nothing we are showing in any of these videos or any of this teaching at all ever is intended to be used in order to make any firearm not a legal firearm. The implication of not enough trigger height and not enough trigger travel is when the slide comes back forward, this trigger lever can slip under the Sear lever, activate it again while the trigger is pulled, firing off another round without actually pulling the trigger more than once. So that's a scenario that must be avoided in all high power pistols. So what we're showing you here is that a minimum amount of trigger travel that activates the Sear lever and positions the trigger lever when the trigger is pulled high enough so that this Sear lever reliably, this engagement surface right here, reliably engages the trigger lever here when the trigger lever is up, pushes it forward. This is necessary for the design. The design does not function without a minimum amount of trigger travel. And duplicating the 1911's trigger travel is impossible because of the way that this design works. However, it is very well possible to optimize this design to make certain things in certain triggers on high powers better. We call this trigger tuning, and we're going to be getting into that in our next session. But we wanted to build this foundational kind of basics about, what these parts are, where they are, how they work, how they integrate together. Next time, we're going to be talking about this Type 1 Sear lever. That Type 1 Sear lever looks like this. That's the original Sear lever. That's what depresses down on the Sear. This is the Type 2 Sear lever. This is the one that is a drop safety design. In everything that we've just talked about, the height of this trigger lever, and all of that discussion, the discussion is actually different depending on which one of these Sear levers you have in your high power. We're going to get into all that in our next sessions. One more thing, this is important, and this video is getting longer than intended, but one more thing about your Sear levers in your high power pistols. There are polish points and there are not polish points, and I'm going to show you that right now. The Sear lever part, this is the Type 1. The parts that are okay to polish, the inside of this trigger hole is okay. If you have a way to polish it, you can polish it. It will make it float more freely. It needs to. However, no removal of metal in here. The sides of the trigger lever, what we call the sides, this surface and this surface, looks like this surface and that surface. From end to end, it is okay to polish. And I've just shown you all of the polish points on the Sear lever. The top of the body, this whole area, this engagement surface here, this surface right here, that's where your trigger lever engages. You remember in the schematic, it looked like it was in this position. Trigger lever engages here. These engagement surfaces are not polish points at all, ever. And you don't want to go there on either one, the Type 1 or the Type 2. Polishing all of this area, just don't do it. And under no circumstances do you want to polish the engagement surface here, the engagement surface here with the trigger lever. And on the top side, there's no pluses, no benefit to you for polishing that either. So sides, fine. Sear lever pinhole, okay. Everything else should not be polished on your Sear lever part. I'm Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com. And next time we're going to carry this deeper, this discussion deeper about the whole high powers trigger, specifically what's realistic for distance of take up, trigger break, over travel, how much reset, when should I hear this reset in the course of the forward travel of the trigger, where that reset is in the forward travel. We're going to get into all of that with a lot of specifics next time. Take care, guys. Thank you.